Welcome to the Rig Doctor Podcast, where I'm giving out remedies to soothe your ailing tone and fix your sick pedal boards. I'm your host, Mason Marangella, aka the Rig Doctor. I've been building rigs for over a decade for many of the industry's top pros, and now I'm giving away all my secrets to DIYers just like you. I'm giving away all my tricks, tips, resources, and easy hacks that I've learned over the years so that you too can build a rig just like the pros. If you want to support this podcast, you can do so by sharing it on social media, subscribing to our podcast, or following us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. You can also support this podcast financially by purchasing one of my products, Vertex Effects, from any of our authorized dealers, or becoming a member of our Patreon page. We have several membership levels as low as $4.99 a month that give you exclusive access to private live streams and Q&As, exclusive deals and discounts on Vertex products, as well as access to new product releases before anybody else. Also, you can get personalized one-on-one phone and email consultations with me, the Rig Doctor. This could be as in-depth as troubleshooting your pedal board with me in real time, or advising you on the best way to build your next rig. As always, I don't want money to be the block that prevents you from having your best possible tone. If you cannot afford to be a supporting member of our Patreon, you can always email us at info@vertexeffects.com, and our team will grant you full access to our standard tier of privileges on Patreon, free of charge, no means testing required. We trust that when your financial circumstances change, you will let us know and become a supporting member at that time. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Blue Microphones, for providing Yeti microphones for us to record all of our podcasts with, as well as our live streams. I'd also like to thank my own company, Vertex Effects, for providing the resources to make all of this stuff happen. If you are interested in sponsoring this podcast, you can always email us at info@vertexeffects.com, and we would be happy to hear from you. In today's episode, I'm going to be speaking with Tony Lowe. Tony Lowe has been a great friend of mine for many years and is an expert when it comes to vintage amplifiers, guitars, and pedals, and in fact worked at one of the premier vintage guitar dealers in Ohio for many years. We're going to be talking about Stevie Ray Vaughan and John Mayer, and Tony's going to talk about the reasons that he doesn't like John Mayer while I vehemently defend John Mayer and some of those classic tones that he got. So this is actually a good fun one, and kind of takes two different angles of a commonly disputed guitar player, which I really love, but some people are not as big of fans of. So without further ado, I bring you Tony Lowe. All right, so what are we talking about today?
Well, last time we talked, we kind of started on this idea of the interactions of different components of the rigs, and we went pretty deep in the weeds talking about Zapata and stuff. Why don't we talk about some popular tones that people chase and how the components are working together to make that sound instead of just, I'll buy the pedal they have, for example.
Okay, so popular tones to chase, and then pedals that are going to get you there.
Well, more like pedals. Why just a pedal is never going to get you there.
Why a pedal's never going to get you there. Okay.
But yeah, and we can. This is good. This is good. Tell me. Let's start with this, and maybe you'll see what I mean in a second.
Okay.
So
take me there.
What would be an example? You know better than me, working with all these guitar players. What's an example of a tone that people are currently kind of? What's the thing? What are they doing?
Well, I think that they're kind of. It seems like there's a kind of like the canonized archetype, sonic archetypes that people go after, and it's probably the usual suspects that you would consider. So guys like Jimi Hendrix, Stevie Ray Vaughan, John Mayer, and then I think that there's also kind of guys who are maybe more insider type guys like Robin Ford, Eric Johnson, and maybe even like more inside guys that might be into like a John Frusciante or one of those type of guys, but guys who are more effects driven players that are also popular guitar players. Those are the type of guys that we're going after. So I mean, I think if we were to narrow it down to kind of maybe top 5, I think it'd be like Hendrix, Stevie Ray Vaughan, John Mayer, Eric Johnson, and maybe a guy like a Robin Ford. But then there's kind of like other genre specific stuff. Like there may be people that really want to have like the Joe Satriani thing or the Steve Vai thing.
Okay.
But I think at least the guys that come to me, they're kind of more in that blues, rock, jazz, fusion era, and so in terms of their interests, and so they're kind of more pushing me in that direction. So I could probably speak more intelligently to those, and less so to a Zakk Wylde or a Joe Satriani or a Steve Vai.
Okay. Well, I will be straight up. I will tell you right now that as a music listener, as a guitar player, as a tone enthusiast, I don't get this whole John Mayer thing. One, I don't think that that's I don't think there is a signature tone there. Period.
Okay.
But I know I'm gonna probably get all kinds of hate for this. I don't care. That man does not have a tone. He's a guy who's really good at playing guitar, impersonating a bunch of different people. So boom, there it is. Hammer dropped.
Okay.
Shots fired. I don't care.
Okay.
That's mean. Maybe. I don't know. But I do think that we can. I would be. That's really cruel, huh? But I'm down to talk about one of the other people, and I know. I think people that are chasing John Mayer are probably really actually chasing the Stevie Ray. So
I think I disagree with that.
Okay. Yeah, explain it to me, and maybe I'm wrong. I'm down to be wrong. Explain the John Mayer phenomenon.
Yeah. Well, I think that people that go to that probably have a more surface level knowledge of his music. And I think that because I think if you actually hear John Mayer play Stevie Ray Vaughan songs, he actually doesn't really do it as well as like a Philip Sayas or a Zapata even would do a Stevie Ray Vaughan thing. Like I think Stevie Ray Vaughan was like the door into kind of like understanding the blues for John Mayer. And so I think that there are some reference points or some beacons that come up in solos that might reference some of that stuff. But I think that his approach as he's evolved has become very different than what you would hear in a Stevie Ray Vaughan solo. I think that he outlines changes not like a jazz guy would, but more than Stevie Ray Vaughan would, who is really anchored to the pentatonic or blues scale in what he did, and was certainly a master technician of that. But I think it's kind of the similar unfairness that Stevie Ray Vaughan got in comparing him to Albert King. And I think that like people who weren't really interested in trying to find nuance in what differentiated Stevie from Albert King said, well, he's just like Albert King.
Well,
but I think
I'm sorry. I think we're talking about two different things, because if we're talking about playing, I'm not suggesting that John Mayer doesn't play things other than Stevie. I'm talking about a signature tone, a tonality of guitar. Like John Mayer's totally a schooled player, and Stevie could play just like Albert when he wanted to, but he also had a signature, not only musical thing, but a tone thing.
Just follow me for a second on this one. So I think I'm going to get there for you. But if I don't, tell me. So I think then getting back into like the nuances of the tone, I think John, having been on stage with his pedal board, a couple feet away from him as he's dialing in stuff, as he's getting tones dialed in. I never saw Stevie Ray Vaughan live in person, so it's hard for me to say exactly what it was. But John Mayer, to me, actually has a much more, like we talked about in one of the last episodes about how a lot of people compensate to get the Stevie Ray Vaughan tone by adding in gain on a tube screamer, which actually ends up really making the tone become even more mid-range emphasized. Because with Stevie Ray Vaughan, when you saw him use a tube screamer, he almost turned the gain off, and it was like a volume boost and an EQ that tightened up the mid-range, cut some of the low end out, because some of those Fenders can get really farty when they get loud.
Yeah, he's filling in what's missing and taking out what's extra.
And John Mayer does not do that. He actually uses the tube screamer with a fair amount of gain to it. And it actually sounds really honky and mid-rangey in a way that Stevie Ray Vaughan does not. And he's almost using it like a sustain effect in pairing it with then other overdrives. So like a Klon plus TS10, or a Blues Driver plus TS10, or a Katana plus TS10, to kind of like almost push more into this compression realm. And so I actually don't find his tone, even though he's using, at least one steel string Singer amp on the stage at all times. And when I was at one of the last rehearsals, he had his original 2-Rock signature amp and a PRS signature amp on the stage as well, with two 12 cabs, essentially a 412 cabinet for each head. But it was just divided into two 12 cabinets. But it really didn't sound tonally like the Stevie Ray Vaughan thing. It actually, to me, sounded like somewhere between maybe like a really late Stevie Ray Vaughan, like a clean Stevie. Like when I say clean, I mean like no longer a substance abuse era Stevie Ray Vaughan, mixed with like journeyman era Eric Clapton.
Okay. Well, you know what? I'm going to suck up my pride, and I would like now to
I'm going to send you some of the videos. I can't share these videos publicly because there was like a policy that everybody who was in that rehearsal agreed to, as far as like publishing publicly, so it was just kind of for, use to not be published. But I'm going to send you a few of the things so you can kind of hear. Obviously it's, calibrate your ear to an iPhone, but I think you'll hear that it's kind of like even like the note choices are kind of like, I would almost say more 80s Clapton-y, like Bad Love or
Riverman
or Forever Man.
That's what it is. Sorry, Forever Man. Sorry, Mr. Clapton.
Kind of more of that almost. So anyway, I'll send that to you, and I'm curious what you'll think.
Okay. Well, I want to let's go into it, because you do have a lot of firsthand knowledge of the Mayer rig, and people are into it. And frankly, it seems that a lot of people that are into the stuff that you build with Vertex are really into the John Mayer thing. So let's go ahead and talk about it. And I'm really familiar with his record he did with Pino and Steve Jordan, the trio one.
Yeah.
But I know that he's covered a wide range of other things too. And I do want to say that I'm not actually throwing shade at him as a pop artist. I think he's a fantastic, if I had kids and they're like, hey, I want to get the latest pop thing, John Mayer, I'd be totally happy if that's what they want to hear. I'm only talking about the obsession with the guitar tone, but I'm willing to let's put it in perspective. So let's talk about people chasing John Mayer's tone. And what I want to think about, what are the principal elements of, like, the core elements of what that tone is that they're chasing? And how does John Mayer achieve those attributes? How are people failing at achieving those attributes, and why? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I think that the common things that I see that people make a mistake with him is that they underestimate how clean the amps are, and I think that they overestimate the amount of like the amount of gain that's being used in how much of it is studio treatment versus like how it actually sounds in the room, because live he still sounds incredible, but there is a certain compression thing that's definitely like what you're hearing in the studio, that is not exactly the same as like what you would hear live or what you could even reasonably achieve in your bedroom. So I think that like if I were recommending how to sound like John Mayer to somebody who is mostly playing indoors and not gonna get an amp that's really loud, they need to have something that I think is pretty clean, Fendery, scooped, and I think you need to definitely have a Celestion speaker in that amp, because there's a color in the mid range that those Celestion speakers have that a Jensen in a deluxe reverb just doesn't have. So
that is a great place to start coming in from backwards, right? Because the sound that people are hearing are what's coming off of those cabinets.
Right. And, having two 212 cabinets, and he's kind of doing, what the Stevie Ray Vaughan thing is where he has multiple amplifiers that run at once. So he may, on a lead tone, have the steel string singer running with the 2-rock. And then on a rhythm sound, he may have the steel string singer running with the Paul Reed Smith amp. And so he's kind of doing that thing that like Stevie did, where he almost had 3 split mono signals or 4 split mono signals that are just bringing in amplifiers to really move air in different ways and different textures. And sort of like what we talked about with Zapata, where he has the Marshall Plexi and the dual Showman set up to kind of fill in different textures. John Mayer is definitely doing that sort of vibe where he's got multiple amps on at the same time that are sort of EQing the overall sound. And,
right.
Mics have an effect on that too. He uses sort of unusual mics for close micing guitar cabs. He's using a SM7B, which is a vocal mic, but can take a tremendous amount of SPL. And so
it's a fat low end too.
Yeah, and so it sounds really huge, close mic'd on and he's really using almost exclusively in all those cabs Celestion G1265s. I think some of them had some Alessandro speakers in them that weren't the ones that you can buy over the counter. I think that they were like customized ones, but for the most part they were G1265s, ceramic. Which is fine, and you can put that in a deluxe reverb, which is the beautiful thing. If you don't have, most of us aren't going to be able to fit, multiple 412 cabinets in our, guitar playing rooms, but getting a deluxe reverb and putting a Celestion G1265 is certainly in the realm of possibility.
Okay, so let's stay there for a second. I kind of want to slow you down, and I want to talk a little bit about the amps for a second.
Yeah.
And the speakers as kind of like one part of this whole thing. So he's got his multiple amp setup. Now you and I have played through Henry Kaiser's Dumble,
right?
The one that looks like a Christmas tree,
right?
And okay, so I know about what that one sounds like. They're all different, as people say, I guess. What I've never played through the steel string singer. Now I've heard you say that it has even clean and at low volume a surprising amount of compression. Can you talk about the experience of, if let's say he turns off his other amp and you're just hearing that steel string singer, what's happening over there on that side of the stage?
So it has a really really a really, really precise sort of compression to it. Not so much in like what you might think of like in terms of a Dynacomp or a Boss CS3 or something like that, or a Ross. It's kind of like more like a studio sort of treatment you might get out of some sort of like 1176 or something like that. It sort of like contains the bandwidth of the signal, but also has this snap. And, people really forget that amp sort of like came into guitar players' hands completely accidentally because of what Stevie Ray had, how Stevie Ray kind of got involved with Dumble amps through Jackson Browne and, was playing that, essentially a bass amp on all those David Bowie records, or at least on, China Girl and what's the other one? Let's Dance and Cat People and all the stuff that was on the Let's Dance album that he played on.
Yeah, and to be clear for folks, when you say a bass amp, this, if I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, the Steel String Singer is an SVT, with an Ampeg SVT amp, and it may even be the transformers and chassis from an SVT, if I understand right. And then he just he put a guitar preamp in it, basically. Does that sound about right?
Well, I've heard Bruce Egnater tell that story, but the one that Henry Kaiser has is not that. So I don't know the degree to which that is universal, because every Dumble that I've seen the inside of was sort of an amalgamation of things, and I struggle to think that they're all built necessarily with different parts because he felt like those were optimal for the player more so than that's what he had on hand at the time. So I think like if he had Showman transformers, he was going to use them. If he had, another fill in the blank 100-watt, transformer, he was going to use that. And I think that this is, why you see a disparity. I mean, I'm sure he did voicings customized to people, but I think he knew that there was more than one way to skin a cat.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. And if you imagine that you have the skills of Dumble in terms of how he can steer the outcome of a tone inside of an amp chassis, he's got those kinds of ears and design chops. If you're building an amp from scratch and tweaking as you go to rein it in late 70s or early 80s, what better transformer are you going to get than something you're pulling out of one of those great big Fenders or a Ampeg?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that was the thing, and I think that there was only so many ways. Like in particular, on the one that was used, that from Jackson Browne, I don't know, I've never seen that amp, so I don't know, but I know it was like 200 watts, and so there probably was only so many options that were available. There was no Mercury Magnetics, where you could, call in and buy one 200 watt, transformer. Like that just didn't exist. And so a lot of it was about salvage, and how do you kind of reclaim parts of non-functional amps and, things like that. And so I think that although I'm not discounting the how factual Bruce Egnater's story is, and you can read that online, he kind of does like basically, the description he makes, he kind of makes like a house call to a venue where they were having problems with an amp, and he was there to fix it. And he kind of said, oh, well, it was really just a SVT, and, these things were changed. You have to remember that Stevie Ray Vaughan's Steel String Singer, if it's the one that I think that Bruce is referencing, I don't know if you have seen it, it looks completely different than any of the other Steel String Singers, where it's black and the chassis looks different. It like all the knobs are at the bottom of the head as opposed to at the top of the head. So it has like a fundamental difference. Like it kind of like how like a Marshall, right? All the knobs are on the very bottom of the head.
Yeah.
Whereas if you look at like other Steel String Singers, like the one that John Mayer has, all the knobs are oriented toward the top, right? And the power tubes are hanging down.
All right.
And so, there maybe that was where Stevie went with it. He's like, I don't really like this thing about the the steel string singer that you made me before. I need it with more, I need a bigger transformer. I need it louder. I need it cleaner. I'm only presuming what it was that he said. But there also is this phenomenon, and again, I don't know Bruce at all, and my instinct is to take him at his word. But I also know that there's this phenomenon where it's like when you take your car to a different mechanic, they kind of have a tendency to speak poorly about the person that had it before them.
Yeah, that's true.
And so, or they do things that are different than what they would do. And so there is this phenomenon I've noticed even amongst pedal builders where they can oversimplify something that somebody has done and kind of talk about it in a reductive way that really doesn't express any of the nuance of that particular circuit or what that person has done or any of the background. And it can, written, it can seem, it can be hard for the laid person to really be able to distinguish what's been said versus what was actually in the amp. And so that would just kind of be my the grain of salt to take along with us.
Well, fair enough. Let's bring it back then, with all that in mind, to John Mayer's steel string singer. He's got it over there, and we've established that he's plugging it into did you say 2 or 4 Celestions? You said
so. There was 2 212 cabinets with each amplifier, which are all Paul Reed Smith, except for I think 2 of them were Alessandro cabinets.
All right, and how does he? If we're just hearing that steel string singer, we're talking about basically a completely pristine, clean sound, I'm guessing. Is that right?
I mean, it's clean, but it's also pretty compressed, So like if it almost sounds like if you took a really beautiful twin reverb and kind of put a really nice kind of compressor and limiter on it, so that you kind of only got the sweet stuff, out of it. Like it was almost like no harshness in it whatsoever.
I gotcha. Okay, I kind of get that. And frankly, it sounds well. No, I'm not gonna say that, but. I guess I will say that. It reminds me of what you're describing reminds me of how I felt about plugging into just the clean side of the Dumble that I played at your house. It's a big platform clean sound, but I get that the steel string is that to that.
Yeah, I would even say compared to that one that Henry had loaned us, was even more exaggerated in its compression. And also, like, there's almost like a snappiness to it. But, like sometimes if you dial, say, like a Ross or an Orange Squeezer or something like that to get a snap, there's also like a dulling effect that happens to the top end. And that just doesn't happen on the Dumble. It's almost like you can get it to still maintain like a certain amount of punchiness without it becoming dull or lifeless. Like the notes still feel very forward in the speaker and present.
All right. So when the John Mayer tone that I'm familiar with, the other amp was always, I think for that trio record, it was a Fender Vibroverb or something. He had 2 rocks and Vibroverbs.
Yeah, I think it was kind of a few different things. And I think that there was even a Marshall, like a reissue Marshall on that stage too, like a JTM 45. I think there was different amps going on.
Okay.
And then I think even when they would kind of do the stripped down thing, like I remember when that started, they kind of first debuted right when the tsunami, where was that? Was that in like Bali or Indonesia? There was like a tsunami relief and a Red Cross relief thing, and then also Hurricane Katrina had happened around the same time. And they had done these shows, where they have the phone banks. Where you can call in and talk to Shakira and she'll, take your donation over the phone for the Red Cross. And they were doing a concert, they did a few songs for the purposes of kind of that television, donation marathon thing. And it was just the 2 rock. It was a really stripped down thing. Like I think Steve Jordan played a cocktail kit. standing up kit. Pino was just had the SVT, and then John just had the Two Rock signature amp, and that was it. So I think that they could do. I think depending on the song, they could do a stripped down version. But yeah, I think it was a combination of a few things. I think they had the Two Rock. I think they had the Vibro Verb, which was a reissue. I'm fairly confident.
The Cesar Diaz mods.
Right. Yeah. And I think I saw a newer like JTM 45, kind of more of the Hendrixy thing, because he was doing Hendrix covers on that, like Wait Until Tomorrow and stuff like that.
Yeah. Which, by the way, well, no, I won't. That one, the rhythm of it is weird for me. Like, it's a weird take, but I do like that record, I think, and I love Steve Jordan. So, okay, so what is he doing when you were on stage with him? What's the deal with the PRS? I didn't even know he was using any PRS stuff because I don't follow it. But so what's that amp, and what's the nature of that sound?
The truth is I don't know a lot about the amp, other than that. I don't know that I necessarily like heard it and was like, oh, it sounds so like Dumbly. I think it probably had some influences from that, but I think it's also kind of just like a really beautiful, clean amp that kind of has some of that compression element, had an effects loop, but I don't know. He definitely had a rack behind the amps that was like bringing in a Bricasti rack reverb, and there was a few other pedals that were in there. Like he kind of does, like, again, kind of talking about how he did that clap thing. He has this like rotary thing that he kind of puts on some of the solos. Like, I don't know if you remember in some of those early Clapton or the 80s era Clapton solos, there was like kind of some modulation on some of the solos. It was very subtle.
Yeah, do you know the story there? I've heard something about what that is.
No, just tell me about it.
So I've heard that he would play a small amp, like a Champ or something,
right,
aimed into a Leslie cab that was rotating, and then he would mic. So it wasn't mic'd through the Leslie speaker. It was just a little amp, and then it would be aimed into it. I don't know if that's true or not, but something about just like, for some reason, miking the resonance of the Leslie thing.
Right.
I don't know if that's true.
Right.
But he also used a lot of chorus. On things, and that's a whole different thing. That's like a Dynasonic or something, I think.
Yeah, I don't know what he used, but I know that Mayer, and again, I didn't open the drawers, like, I didn't have that level of clearance, but it looked like the Korg, I think it was called like a G4.
Oh yeah, that's what. That's the one. Those are great, actually.
It was like a big brown kind of plastic. Enclosure, and they were popular. It was I think it even preceded the Rotosphere, which was that Hughes and Kettner tube rotary one that was popular with like Charlie Hunter and guys like that. But
it's still popular, by the way.
Yeah, I have one. I have one that I'm going to incorporate into my rig, but I just kind of need to figure out the best situation for powering it, since it takes AC and it's kind of a pain. But it sounds great.
Yeah, those are great. And yeah, I do remember the G2. Bonamassa used to use that too.
Or I think it's the G4. The G2 is that the gig rig switcher.
Oh, no. Well, whatever. The Korg rotary thing.
So I'm pretty sure that's what it was, because it looked kind of like those, like piano sustain pedal type foot switches, and it kind of had about that right size. But again, I'm guessing because I couldn't really see clearly in the drawers.
Okay. So let's say, by the way, my phone just did something weird. You can still hear me, right?
Yeah, I can.
Oh, okay. So we've got our two amps. Both are set clean. I'm assuming pretty loud.
Yeah, brutally loud.
Okay, brutally loud. Now that's a critical element. Okay.
Yeah, moving some air.
Yeah, that level of compression and clean is going to be that sound where I think a lot of players are not in a position to have that. I also think that most players, and by most players, I'm not talking about big stage pros. I think that is a special consideration. But I'm saying your average guitar player that's playing in their hometown to a crowd that's made up of people that, it's a small enough crowd that they can walk out into it and shake hands and they're not famous. Does that make sense?
Right.
So that player is probably doesn't have the luxury of playing at that kind of level in the modern day, and
Sure.
maybe never even has.
But at the same time, and this is the thing that I end up reminding people a lot, is sometimes people will look at the live rig and say and presume that that's how the song was recorded or the album was recorded. And so in some ways, it's almost advantageous to bedroom players because they're in a controlled environment, and the studio recording, which is probably their sonic reference point, was also in a controlled environment. So they can actually they're probably better off not trying to look at the live rig and saying, well, I'm just going to replicate this. Because me talking about that it was brutally loud and these things, like, those certainly are factors, but it's also in an application which is very different than probably how he recorded those individual songs.
Well,
you know what I mean?
But that's a great point, Mason, because that, I think, is what's happening is people watch rig rundowns and
yeah, and that stuff is I mean, it's great if you're like, I love the Gary Clark Jr. live tone, but in reality he probably is plugging one pedal into one amp with one guitar and nothing in between, and it's much more isolated and calculated. And the game on the road, going back to John Mayer, is like, well, we're not going to do all these setup changes every time. So I'm just going to have this giant pedal board. I'm going to have this rack and these 3 amps, and we're going to get as close to whatever that sound is. And sometimes they're not even really trying to go totally for what that sound is. They're just trying to go with what they think will work in a live performance or how they want to convey that music in a live performance, which may not necessarily be identical to what the record was. And that kind of varies from artist to artist on the fidelity with which they want to recreate the album sound. But I do think it's an advantage to the bedroom player because they can control, you can mic a 112 cabinet and do, maybe do a little bit different path to get to that tone, but probably get more of the sound you hear in your head than you would trying to recreate the live rig and use it live.
Okay, so let's do this then. So we've talked a little bit about what kind of wattage and speakers and power we're talking about on the Mayer stage. Say your average Joe guitar player, I'm going to say 9 out of 10 times he or she is playing through, let's say, a Fender Hot Rod Series amp.
Sure.
That's probably the most common thing seen, I would expect.
Yeah, Hot Rod Deluxe.
Yeah, Hot Rod Deluxe, Hot Rod DeVille, if they still make them? They make them.
Oh, yeah, they do. They're on like version 4 now or something.
Yeah, and if they're super smart, maybe a Blues Junior.
Well, there's also a complication there because then you get away from the Fender thing because, I mean, they still kind of sound Fendery, but they're EL84.
No, I know. It's a small, and it's super farty for most guys. I get it. But so let's say they're making their amp is a Hot Rod Deluxe or Hot Rod DeVille. That's right. Probably the most common thing.
Sure.
So they're chasing the John Mayer thing, and they don't know what they like. They just like John Mayer, dang it. And they've seen him live. It was cool. It was exciting. They love the sound on the records. How does that player game their setup in terms of like setting the amp and choosing pedal elements to kind of chase after that basic vibe? I'm not talking about the extras, the exact rotary speaker, the core tone. Yeah, the core tone. What should they be trying to do?
Yeah, so I mean, I think step one is you got to replace the speaker. Because you have to have something that's going to kind of juice the mid-range in a way that a Celestion will and a Eminence copy of a Jensen speaker won't. So like you could get a G1265 if you wanted to really be true, but you're also competing with a lot of other variables here too that I don't know that necessarily, you're going to be so much better off if you chose a G1265 versus which I actually think is a better speaker for a 112 application, which is the Eminence ET65, warehouse guitar speakers, ET65, which is essentially their version of a G1265. But I think it produces a better bass for a 112 because most of the guys that are using G1265s are not using it in a 112. They're using 212s or 412s. And you automatically, because you have more surface area on the ground, you're just going to have a different bass response. And so the ET65, I think, addresses that for 112s in the best possible way.
But by the way, I love. I've never heard a bad speaker from Warehouse Guitar speakers.
Yeah, they build really good stuff, and I think that speaker is like $80. So it's sort of like a really low price point to kind of get the Celestion thing that's voiced well. And the other thing that I should mention is that the Hot Rod Deluxe is difficult to change speakers on because a lot of them don't fit. Like you can't put an Alnico speaker in there because of how the amp chassis fits into the cabinet. So you can't have a magnet that's too deep, otherwise it'll hit the tubes.
Yeah, and you don't want an Alnico speaker in that amp for the John Mayer thing.
No, you don't.
I don't think I would recommend it to anyone. It's just going to be a bright, ugly
Well, there was a time that John was using a combination of G1265s and Celestion Golds, but the Golds are higher power handling, so it's a little bit different than, say a Blue or something like that. But anyway, that's an aside. I would say get the ET65, put it in your Hot Rod DeVille, and you're only going to be using the clean channel. And the thing that Stevie did and John does is they take the bass out of the amp completely. So they roll the bass to 0, or 1 or whatever.
That is a big deal. That's something that people do not do.
And a lot of the reason is, and Scott Henderson has a really interesting sort of talk about this, is that most amps, when you bring up the bass, it's actually not producing real low end. And what it's doing is it's actually taking the actual low end and it's shifting it into the low mids. And so you end up kind of getting sort of a substandard bass sound. And if you actually dialed it out, you get more of that realistic kind of low end snap, like when Stevie Ray Vaughan like pulls the E string out away from the pick guard and lets it, snap back onto the fretboard. It gets that really kind of like tighter, bigger bass in a way. So it's sort of like counterintuitive that you would roll it off like that, but it really works well on those amps in particular to just turn the bass off and turn off the presence. Because go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I want to see if you agree with me on this, because I always found that playing a black panel Fender, and I'm assuming it's the same thing when playing the Hot Rods. I haven't owned one of those amps, so I'm
sitting next to 2 of them right now.
Okay. When you turn the bass off and you run the mid-range knob up, you're actually not getting a terribly mid-rangey sound.
No, you almost can't get them too mid. You almost can't. Even if you maxed it out, you won't really get that much mid out of it.
When I played an old Super Reverb, the bass was way down. I'm talking 3, something like that. And I had the mids and treble high, bright switch off, knob cranked.
Mm-hmm.
And that's with a really bright sounding guitar.
Mm-hmm.
So when you get them up to a certain volume, by the way, that bright switch is almost kind of like it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
So, but go ahead.
So bass off, presence off, because presence is like, people have different definitions of like what frequency range that is. I think on these Fenders, it's maybe somewhere in like the 5K area.
Right.
But that frequency is not, especially if you're going for that John Mayer thing, like that's too bright. Like maybe if you were doing like a really kind of thinner Mark Knopfler thing, maybe that might be more necessary. But for this, it's not. So I'd take off the presence, take off the bass, mid-range somewhere around kind of the middle of the road, treble maybe around the same, and then volume to taste. Now a thing that players should know about the Hot Rod Deluxe is the volume is really jumps up quick. So sometimes people that are playing in homes and they need to kind of have some control over how much output is there, it can be difficult because you can move it sort of like a centimeter and you're going to get 8 or 10 dB jump. One common mod that's really, really easy to do, or that almost any tech, even not particularly skilled tech, could do, is just changing the pot out for a audio taper instead of a linear taper is a really easy way, and that really will give you a more gradual increase in the volume, so you don't all of a sudden get like an 8 dB jump, because they can be hard to dial if you're trying to dial it for a room where volume is a concern. So just a quick aside on that. So from there, what I would do is you really only need, I think, a couple of staples to get the John Mayer thing. You need, and the other thing I should say is you have to, obviously you're going to use some reverb from the amp. So the Hot Rod Deluxe has a reverb, tank in it, and you can use that to kind of dial the reverb to taste. But the thing that you really need to have is a slapback delay of some kind. Now John Mayer typically uses the Aquapus, but a Boss DM2 reissue could be one way to go. You could also go with, say, the Carbon Copy, which is a little bit dark, but they make a bright version as well now. Could be usable to kind of get into that zone, and is certainly an affordable pedal used if you wanted to get it secondhand. So kind of setting that for like a single repeat, almost kind of like a reverby, like Brian Setzer type thing. It's like a single repeat, kind of just to add a little air into the notes. It's not used for long delays.
Yeah, that sounds kind of like the Brad Paisley approach too, is the slap with an Aquapus or something.
Yeah, and really the Aquapus is really a 1-to-1 DM2. So like if you didn't want to drop the $800 or whatever it is for original Aquapus, you could just as easily go and get an original Boss DM2 with the Panasonic MN3005 chip for probably $250. And it's really the same thing, but it's, it doesn't have a true bypass switch, but I don't know. I always thought the Boss DM2s were way cool, and not that the Aquapus is a bad pedal or anything like that, but I just thought, if you knew what they were, you could definitely get there less expensively. But anyway, so there's a couple of different options. From there, then you need to have a tube screamer. You need to have a tube screamer of some kind. Now he uses a TS10. And those have become kind of collectible now as a result of that. But I really think you could still get in that terrain with a TS9. Even the newer reissues, you can get pretty close. Or you could get one of the Analog Man or Robert Keeley modded ones as well. And I think that those will all get you kind of in that zone. Or if you want to go boutique, JHS makes that one that has like every generation of tube screamer that you can toggle, a rotary switch between to get every sort of iteration of tube screamer.
Yeah, and I mean, let's be real, man. Like to do what we're talking about, plug into a hot rod amp with I'm of the philosophy that really any tube screamer will do you.
Yeah, I think pretty much anyone will do, and if I had to just drop a sleeper one that I think is really good and not often looked at, is Maxon made one called I think it was called the OD808.
Yep, the little rectangle one, right?
Yeah, so it kind of comes in the style box of like a MXR Phase 90, and those are really good ones, and they sound great. And or the Voodoo Labs Sparkle Drive is another kind of sleeper one that sounds really good and is a little different. It's got a clean paralleled clean bleed that you can kind of bring in to kind of clean up the sound a little bit. That's also really cool and kind of a sleeper. And then what you need is some sort of boost, and he likes to boost into his distortion pedals to add more saturation. So he likes the Keeley Katana, which kind of has like a kind of a stiff sound to it to me. But you could, go with a lot of different types of boosts and kind of get there. Like MXR micro amp might be, a cheap option to get there, or like a TC Electronic Spark.
Mason, you're saying this is before the Screamer?
Yeah, so he doesn't boost after, like he has some other drives sometimes that he'll put after it, but typically when he's boosting it for, like, let's say he's got on his Tube Screamer for kind of his rhythm sound, and then he goes for a lead, he just saturates the input more, and that kind of raises the volume some, but more than raising the volume a few dB, it's also adding a lot more saturation to the signal.
So it sounds kind of like he's using that clean platform as his bass, and then the Tube Screamer E pedal is offering him what I look for in my core amp sound, or in other words, that's the basic overdriven texture when he wants it. And then the boost is almost like somebody would use a range master to boost a Marshall. It's just boosting that pedal to kind of put it into a different level of
because I think as you saturate a Tube Screamer more, it actually becomes even more mid-rangey. And then the perception audibly is that it actually becomes more pointed and that you actually hear it better. The more that mid-range kind of becomes exaggerated, and then it adds some dBs. Now on his actual setup, he might also change amps at that point where he's got an amp set to have more output. But if you're dialing in your house to get a specific tone, obviously there's not any need for immediacy for you to hit a button to go from rhythm to dirty tone, right? You're sort of playing for your own pleasure at that point. You don't need to be able to have you're not doing like a play along necessarily where you have to be able to immediately go to like a John Mayer lead tone from a John Mayer rhythm tone. So you presumably you would probably have to reset maybe a few of the settings to kind of get, more of a lead tone versus a rhythm tone, let's say.
Okay.
And then I really think that that's it. Obviously you can add, like I looked at his kind of Mayer trio board as kind of being the quintessential elements, and really that's pretty much what it had. The only thing I'd say that it added is it had the Boss blues driver that was modded by Keeley that kind of was what he used in the kind of like the 2 and 4 positions, because you lose a little bit of warmth and brightness on those, even though they're and they tend to be quackier, but you lose some output, you lose a little bit of the definition. And the Keeley blues driver kind of had this presency kind of like top end thing that in those positions really worked well. So if you're thinking of like the song Vultures, for example, where I can't remember whether he's in the 2 or the 4 position, but he's in one of those in-between positions. And it really kind of helps make it a little bit more barky and jangly, and kind of, if he had hit the Tube Screamer there, it I don't know that it would have helped exaggerate the kind of the frequency that you want in a 2 and a 4 position, where you want it to be a little squawky or a little bit more, kind of like chimey and out of phase. I don't know that the mid-range helps exaggerate the qualities of what that does. And so he would go for the blues driver as kind of like a different flavor. And then, of course, he had the Katana, which we talked about already. And then he had a second delay. He had a T-Rex replica. And that was doing some of the longer kind of textural stuff.
Okay.
And I think that, those are really the core tones. Like you could do 90% of the John Mayer catalog using that sort of stuff.
Now, wouldn't you think, let's say that I am a guitar player and, I'm not trying to do an impersonation of John Mayer. I just like that sound.
Right.
But for the most part, I'm playing my, Strat style guitar, and I do leave the amp a little bit driven. So the amp's a little bit driven, and I'm rolling back my volume pedal or my volume knob for the clean bits, and then my core tone is usually a little overdriven.
Mm.
Would you agree that that's a person that would, as we were like we were saying with Stevie Ray, but to a different end, they might achieve the same kind of a lead type sound by just giving the tube screamer some level and taking some of the drive off.
Yeah. Because if your amp already has some grit to it, adding more saturation from the pedal may make the amp itself sound smaller, like in a way that's displeasing. Because the gain on the tube screamer, like I said, kind of tends to point the mid-range frequency, kind of the bandwidth of that pedal to have more of a nose. Whereas if you do the Stevie Ray Vaughan thing, where you're kind of like basically like volume and gain were like opposite each other. So you can imagine gain would be, say, at like 9 o'clock, and volume would be like at 3 o'clock. So they'd be like pointing like opposite directions of each other. Sure. Or sort of the inverse. And then he cranked up the tone quite a lot on it as well. Because tube screamers don't really get that bright. Even, I mean, it'll get brighter probably than maybe what you would want it to be, but it's not going to get like a rat or anything like that, even if you cranked it up. And so I have a feeling that, and I have no proof of this, and I'm sure that there's somebody who knows the nuances of Stevie Ray's tone better than I do, but I don't think he used the bright switch on his amps. But I think he probably wanted something in between. And there's guys that I've seen that get his tone, and that I've watched them set up their amps, and they kind of turn it up, and then they bring in the bright switch and kill a lot of the treble on the treble control, and kind of see. It's almost like they play this game every time they set it up. Like, okay, am I getting the sort of treble response that I want in this room by putting on the bright switch and taking the treble almost completely out, or turning off the bright switch and bringing the treble up, higher than, maybe 50%. And again, I've never asked these guys about it, but I've seen guys like Zapata do that, who really do a good job at kind of getting the bigness and the air movement of like a Stevie Ray type sound. And I've watched him do that on his amp and kind of experiment with like, okay, in this room, which way is working better for me to get that tone?
The key thing there is he's actually listening to the room.
Right, and so it's not just that thing where you put tape markers on where you want your amp set, because it's every room is super dynamic.
Yeah. That's the crux of what we're talking about is
right.
Like you're dialing in with an intention.
Right.
You're not just
sticking in your USB stick and having Kemper do the work for you.
Yeah. Although, whatever, if that's what tickles your pickle, I guess you have that right.
Is that an old Toledo saying?
I don't know, man. I gotta tell you, Mason, all my Ohio friends say, oh, it makes so much sense you went to California because you're just so not like us. Everyone in California is like, this dude is so from this little town in the middle of nowhere. But he's not like us. I think I might just be weird.
Well, I think everybody's got their proclivities, I never saw you eat a casserole, to your credit.
I never did, but I was amazed when I found out that y'all don't eat casseroles.
Well, I did because my mom's from Minnesota, but,
Minnesota, don't you know? Yeah, sure you betcha, with the casseroles there.
Yeah, and all these weird names for them, too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, you got your stroganoff real popular up there.
Yeah. No, my mom was more of a fan of what she called hot dagos, which was basically just a meatball casserole, a racist way to say a meatball casserole.
Yeah. Well, this is a major sideways move on this conversation.
Yeah, but we were in the thick of this for a while, so that was sort of that was the breath that we needed to come back to it with more vigor.
Yeah. Well, no, it's another. It's a topic I'm quite fond of.
Yeah.
And I've learned in my many travels that I never knew that this part of the country had its own culture. I always thought I grew up with a void of culture. Living in California, I learned that people thought it was quaint that I grew up on a farm and kind of fascinated by the idea. They were like, "Wait, tell me more about the what it's like to, I don't know, have a well with water, that kind of stuff," just blowing people's minds right and left.
They thought you listened to a lot of Johnny Cougar Mellencamp.
Well, that if you turn on the radio here, you're going to hear a lot of Mellencamp, and you're going to hear a lot of Petty. I will tell you that right now. The other thing is, there is a history to the blandness of our food, and that it's all just kind of combined in a dish is kind of like a very Midwestern thing, but it's very specifically a northern and Western European thing, which is why that landed here.
Right.
So anyway, that's neither here nor there. We actually probably don't need to say much more than that, except
no, I think we kind of did pretty well. I mean, I think if somebody's listening to this and they're kind of wondering what to do, although they may have to endure an hour of talk, I can kind of summarize the broad points probably in a minute here. If you think that'll help people kind of,
I think people will enjoy a wonderful discussion of stuff. People like hearing about stuff, and you've actually been on that stage and been there to hear the stuff in person, which is unique. And you're one of my only friends that I can go over to your house when I'm in California and plug into a real Dumble occasionally, or you never know what.
Right now you can't.
Well,
but our showroom has one.
For people listening, you never know what the heck is going to be going on at the House of Mason. And the people that are over there that I've met at your house and then YouTubed and discovered that they are monsters, that's a whole other thing. Is like, oh, this is like my buddy, and then you're like, oh my God, his buddy is like a beast, and he's a pro, and it's cool. Okay, 2 important questions because the listening world needs to know, because there's stuff that you don't talk about much, and people need to know about Mason a little bit here. What's going on with the coffee? Because Mason is a coffee nut, and the other. So there's just 2 questions to wrap it up. What's up with the coffee, and what's up with Zeke the dog? Because he's always up to no good.
So Zeke's actually right here, and there's this kind of noise. He likes to rearrange his bed a few times a day, and so right now he's doing that. He's kind of trying to figure out in what position exactly the cushion needs to be in. Jenna, my wife, has just got him some festive Christmas sweater, which he's wearing. Zeke is a Vizsla, which is a Hungarian hound dog, and he doesn't have long hair, so he gets quite cold, even though we're in California, which for many of you would be laughable. A 50-degree day is about as cold as it gets, but Zeke is very intolerant of the cold, so he's got that on, and he's doing just fine. And then in terms of coffee, currently, I am a subscriber of a coffee subscription service out of Denmark called Bean Bros. It sounds like it's like a coffee fraternity or something like that. And they've sent me, I don't remember the name of the company, but essentially they kind of curate coffee every month, and then they send me, I think, 3 or 4 pounds a month to like last the month, but seldom do we ever get a full month out of it. Usually we run out about week 2.5 or week 3, and then have to go and supplement locally. But I actually was enjoying a pour over as we did this podcast.
I figured you would. That's why I asked. I'm picturing you sipping your expensive coffee done to just the right temperature.
Yeah, doing it right at 204 degrees Fahrenheit.
Yep.
Yep, that's definitely me. But thank you, Tony, for we did about an hour and 3 minutes here. I think that we've been pretty good about being judicious with and aware of the timing, and I guess as we continue to do more of these, we'll kind of figure out exactly what the threshold is for listeners, whether this is going too off the deep end or whether they want us to buckle down and do more on subjects like this. But I'll be interested to pick this back up with some other kind of artists and stuff like that, especially the Hendrix and the Stevie Ray and the Eric Johnson thing. That'll be fun.
Well, I would like to take it a different direction and get into some Neil Young, Keith Richards. I would like to take it the opposite direction and talk about tones with little amps that are blowing up. I think that would be fun. Yeah,
that would be fun. I love a good Tweed Deluxe.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Well, cool. All right. So let's call that the end of the official thing then.
All right. I'm going to stop it here. So that was Tony Lowe, vintage guitar, vintage pedal, vintage amplifier expert. He certainly has a particular opinion about John Mayer, although I did try to sway him a bit in sort of what I estimate to be an oversimplification of the best qualities of John Mayer. But we'll see if we can in fact turn Tony over time. But I want to thank you again for listening today, and I want to thank all of the people that are contributing behind the scenes to this. I want to thank Hunter Harrison for editing and mixing this podcast, Mason Mejia for co-producing this podcast, and Tim Marco for creating all the music with which you hear in the intro and outro of this podcast. Until next time, I am Mason Marangella, the Rig Doctor. Adios.